After the first encounter, Chris or Jill return to the entrance hall to find it empty. From there, the game opens up and the player can choose which direction they want to try first. But both stories try and steer the player in a particular direction, the door opposite the dining hall. Being a mostly non-linear experience, breaking this series up into episodes isn't as simple as it is with, say, Donkey Kong Country or Wild Guns. But I figured this is as good a place as any to start. And once I started investigating this part of the mansion, I realized there's a lot more going on than what we see at first glance. Strong, foreboding symbolism, drawing from Greek mythology, a tight, precise manipulation of both gameplay and emotional experience, and finally, an answer as to what happened to Chris when he got separated from Jill and the others at the beginning of the game. This is part 3 of Overthinking Resident Evil. Before we dive into it, if you haven't watched the previous 2 episodes, I strongly suggest you check them out before watching this one. It probably won't be a deal breaker if you don't, but unlike the Overthinking Donkey Kong Country series, this one really does benefit from being watched in order. Now with that out of the way, let's get into it. Picking up where we left off last episode, Chris returns to the entrance hall to find Jill and Wesker missing, with only Jill's handgun left behind. In Jill's story, she returns with Barry to report what they've seen to Wesker, only to find that he's disappeared. They search the first floor, before Barry decides to check the dining hall again and Jill decides to try the door on the other side. They agree to meet back here if anything happens. Jill straight up tells the player which door to try first, and Chris's story hints towards that door too, by placing Jill's gun close to it. But while the game makes it clear which direction it wants you to go, ultimately it leaves the choice up to you. There's not a whole lot of sense in going back the way you came, especially for Chris. Jill can use the lockpick to get into the bar, but it shouldn't really be your first priority. If you want, you can try the second floor of the entrance hall, which gives you 3 more options to choose from. 1 door on the west side and 2 on the east. None of them are terrible choices, and there are no wrong answers really, but let's save them all for another time. For now, let's stick with the door the game wants us to take. This room is so different from anything we've seen so far, and it's a personal favourite of mine, especially the original 1996 version. It's called the Exhibition Room, and it's not hard to see why. Several paintings hang under spotlights, and a stone statue of a woman holding a water jug is the centerpiece of the room. I think there's actually some significance in placing that statue in the center of the room, but first I just want to take a look at the room itself. This room is absolutely dripping in atmosphere. The way the room is lit up solely by spotlights, the way you're walking on tile, but the sounds of your footsteps are deadened, choked quiet and echoless. It all gives off this impression that the room is a soundproofed, climate-controlled space, not unlike something you'd find in a real art gallery or a museum. The entrance and dining halls might look expensive, but to me this room screams real wealth. For the most part, the camera is situated above, looking down, with the one shot looking up from below being used to emphasize the size of the woman drawing water. Not a whole lot to say about it. Nothing too moody, nothing cleverly obscured. There could be a good reason for that though. I've been giving it some thought, and I think the game guides you towards the exhibition room for a reason. More than that, I think the decision to make this room an art gallery of sorts is a very deliberate one. When you break it down, a huge percentage of your time in Resident Evil is spent walking around, looking at your surroundings for clues, cues, and items, and interacting with the environment via the action button. There is absolutely no reason for the paintings on display in this room to be in the game. They don't provide any insight into the mansion or the world, they aren't used in any upcoming puzzles, they're just there. But what did you do the first time you entered this room? You probably walked around, looking at each one and interacting with it to see what they'd tell you. You were, in a sense, practicing. And that's what I love about it. The game acclimates the player to the basics of the controls in this organic, intuitive way that further immerses the player in the world. It doesn't mess with the flow of the gameplay. It doesn't doubt the player's intelligence. Instead, it leverages the player's curiosity into a way to get familiar with the mechanics in this quiet, safe, low-stakes area very early on in the game. Speaking of flow, I want to circle back to the woman drawing water, and more specifically, what she symbolizes, and what that might tell us about what's to come. Both the woman and the water are symbols of life and of purity, or more specifically, purification. And so, passing through the exhibition room, this quiet moment in between that gruesome first encounter and the horrors that lie in wait could be a sort of cleansing moment. I talk a lot on this channel about the flow of a game, how moments of action, emotional intensity, or just plain high difficulty are often buffered with quieter, slower paced moments. This room could be one of those moments. To take the theme of purification further, in the Bible, the act of pouring water has been interpreted as one of repentance for and acknowledgement of past sins, and as humility before God. What past sins Jill and Chris have committed, I don't know, and it hardly matters. The important thing is that the absolution of sins is usually something someone receives before death. It's a bit of a stretch, but that symbol for life could also allude to this being the true beginning of the game, and I suppose that is true in a way. But there could be an alternate meaning. One version of the Greek myth of Danaids saw 49 of the 50 daughters of Danaus, the Danaids, sent to Tartarus, where, as punishment for murdering their husbands on their wedding night, they were forced to carry water jugs, which they'd use to fill a bathtub with water, that they'd be able to use to finally wash themselves clean of their sins. Except the bathtub had a hole in it, and could never be filled, so they were forever trying, never succeeding. Tartarus is analogous to hell, a place where the wicked are judged and subsequently punished. In a roundabout way, the woman drawing water could be the game's way of signaling to the player that they're about to step into the underworld. Or maybe the statue's just there to store the map. I don't know, I'm not a game designer. Walking around the room, you'll no doubt notice the object in the jar. You can't reach it, but there's a small stepladder right there, so it's apparent enough that you've got to use that to reach the jug. Inside is a map of the first floor. The player now gets a bit of an idea as to just how big this mansion really is. It's a small comfort, finding the map this early on. You now have some idea as to how the rooms link up, how you can traverse the first floor. For example, those locked doors in the tea room, you can start to see how you might be able to unlock them from the other side. The map doesn't reveal what's in any of the rooms, or what doors are unlocked, so there's still an element of risk involved. Anyway, pushing this dresser thing the way you pushed the stepladder will get you into what appears to be a storage area. The walls appear to be fabric, or maybe acoustic insulation foam for soundproofing. Your footsteps are louder here, but that's likely because the camera is situated closer to the player. There's still no echo, and there's no room ambience to speak of. This room has great atmosphere, just like the exhibition room. There's this warm, dry, cozy feeling to it, and being a place to store artwork, it's likely climate controlled as well. Round the corner and you'll see some paintings and busts in storage, along with some other stuff and a clearly not dead zombie on the floor. I can't find any clear reference points for the exhibition room in this storage area, but the colours definitely make me think of Dario Argento. There are a bunch of sets and shots in his work that seem to have influenced Resident Evil, and we'll be calling back to his work all throughout this series. But for these two rooms in particular, that contrast of deep blue and vibrant red is so reminiscent of Suspiria to me. I always ignore this part for a while, because it's not really worth getting the ink ribbon behind the zombie at the expense of, at best, a quarter of your ammo. You can always come back when you can spare the bullets. I wonder what this dude's story is. If I had to guess, the way he's unable to stand, the way the entrance was barricaded, and the way he sequestered himself at the very back of the room, makes me think he got bitten and either hid himself away so as not to be a danger to others, or put the cabinet in front of the door to keep other potential infected away. The fact that he can't stand makes me think he might have made a run for it when the outbreak started, only for one of the dogs outside the mansion to mess up his leg. Speaking of zombie dogs, I think it's past time we talk about the next room. The door next to the storage area is locked, and while Jill can use her newly acquired lockpick to get through, Chris is going to have to find the key. This is where their paths deviate. We'll come back to Chris's story in time, but for now, let's continue with Jill. This room is called the L-shaped corridor. That's its official name. It runs along the facade and the right side of the mansion with windows lining the way. Makes an L shape. I don't want to keep drawing comparisons to The Shining, but this room has always reminded me of that hallway where Danny rides his trike around the corner and sees the twins. I know it's visually quite different, but there's just something about it. This room feels very out of place considering what we've seen so far. It looks cheap and even slightly dilapidated, while every other room we've seen so far has been, I wouldn't say super well kept or anything, just more stylish and aesthetically consistent. But we all know the design of the interior is the least interesting thing about this room. Like that first zombie encounter, I feel like the magic of this scene was a bit lost on me. I first played the remake in my early 20s, and I can't help but feel that this would have been so much more impactful if I played it when it came out, as a young kid instead of as an adult. Still ruined a perfectly good pair of pants. And I've got to say, it's really impressive to me that a game like this, on a console that's pushing 30 at this point, can still to this day be both this atmospheric and this terrifying. It isn't hard to see why Resident Evil was such a huge deal back in '96. It's moments like this that show while there were games that came out before it that had horror elements, this really was the first time that the horror genre successfully adapted to the video game medium. Before we continue, let's take a closer look at the scene. The room opens on a wide shot, facing the player. You've got spatial awareness and a good view of what's in front of you, but the camera's still framing the shot like it's a film, not a game. In a film, it's fine to focus on the character. In a game, it can work against you. Still, the view's open enough to put you at ease. If there were zombies, or any enemy for that matter, you'd be able to hear them, and you've got plenty of visible space ahead of you that you have time to react. Perspective switches to behind the player as they get further into the room. Note how close this window is to the camera. The single point perspective draws the player's eye down to the bend in the corridor. In the foreground, we see what appear to be human bones in the cabinet. I'm sure they're played off as something from an archaeological dig or something, but it's still super weird to have human remains in your house. Anyway, again, we're looking at a super wide, very well lit shot. But like in the tea room earlier, the static camera starts to ratchet up that feeling of not being in control. The tension grows as our character gets further and further away, approaching a corner that we can't see around. Chances are, that's where your attention is when this happens. This moment is so masterfully played, and I can't really figure out where to start singing its praises. I mean, for one thing, it's a perfectly executed jump scare. The player gets time to breathe, so there's this lulling into a false sense of security that happens. As the player approaches the bend in the corridor, dread builds up, and as their focus is on the background, there's the sting, and our attention is abruptly shifted into the foreground. While this scene is serviceable as a jump scare and nothing else, to say that's all it is would be selling it short. Look at it from a gameplay perspective. A huge part of the fear stems from the distance between player and avatar. The dog enters the shot through the window in the foreground, literally coming between the player and their character. There's this feeling of helplessness, this loss of control that comes with that. Not only from the way the zombie dog stands between player and avatar, but how it also stands between us and safety. We're too far into the room, and the enemy is blocking the way we came. Our natural instinct to put our backs to somewhere safe has been subverted. And from here, we've got two choices. We can fight, or we can run away. Choose the latter, and this happens. I'm pretty sure this dog is here so that players who enter this room for the first time from the other direction aren't robbed of the jump scare. But it serves a different purpose here. If you took out the first zombie dog before progressing, this event plays on the player's assumption that there are no more surprises. No one expects the same thing twice, because it'd be too obvious. If you chose to run, you've now been punished for it. Now there are two enemies instead of one, and they're coming at you from opposite sides. In a game like this, combat situations don't get messier than that. Best case scenario, you're taking a couple of hits. So what does this encounter teach us? Remember, for a lot of players, this is the first real enemy encounter in the game. That first zombie encounter was scripted, and it gave us somewhat inaccurate expectations. Same goes for the zombie in the art storage area. It told us that these enemies are passive, obstacles to be overcome or avoided when we encounter them. This room tells us the complete opposite. The zombie dogs seem to be actively hunting the player, and they're not the only enemy in the game to do so. And avoidance isn't always the right answer. Finally, just because an area looks safe doesn't mean that it is. In short, it tells us to stay on our toes, because letting our guard down at any time might be fatal. Before we move on, I want to talk about the dogs themselves. The idea of a zombie dog isn't exactly a new one, so it was a bit hard to trace a direct influence from the Cerberus to anything in particular. There's the dogs from the 1976 version of The Omen. The practical effects of the dog monster from Demons 2 has a lot of similarities to the close-ups of the zombie dogs in the intro cinematic. Then there's the general look of Zoltan, Hounds of Dracula. As odd as that choice may be, there's a lot in the film that could have potentially influenced not just the original Resident Evil, but even entries in the series as recent as Village. I'm not saying it is an influence, just that I wouldn't be that shocked if it was. I've been calling them zombie dogs over this series, but that's actually not totally correct. There's a difference between the zombie dogs we see in Resident Evil, the Cerberus, and the zombie dogs we see in other games. The Cerberus is closer to something like the Hunter than a zombie. It's a bioorganic weapon, specifically created for military use by Umbrella. They're a product designed to be sold. Despite their appearance and increased aggression, they may actually have been obedient to some degree. They had handlers that they recognized and responded to, and overall, the Cerberus experiment was deemed a success, and the Cerberus BOW went into some scale of production. The Cerberus we see in the opening cutscene were actually cloned from one of those original experiments, and had escaped during the outbreak and gone feral in the wilderness. Zombie dogs, on the other hand, refers to any good boy infected by the T-virus. In a sense, they are literally zombie dogs. That said, for the rest of this series and also my life, I'm gonna refer to the Cerberus as zombie dogs because fuck saying Cerberus every time I want to talk about them. As much as I hate saying it, I think the name Cerberus is actually quite significant. The Cerberus in Greek mythology was a three-headed dog that guarded the entrance to the underworld. Now let's take a look at the Cerberus's placement in the game. We've just crossed a threshold of sorts in the exhibition room, and so this corridor could serve as a sort of symbolic entrance into hell, and these dogs are between it and us. Jumping ahead a bit, we see them out in the courtyard, specifically the area with the elevator and the area with the waterfall. Maybe in this instance, the lab is the true underworld and the dogs guard the path down. Though I think the mansion itself is probably the closest thing to a metaphor for the underworld. And again, the Hounds of Hell prowled the forest outside the entrance. Their presence in that opening cutscene is more than a catalyst for plot. It's symbolic of the threshold Alpha Team are crossing. There's one last thing I want to cover before we wrap this episode up. This area is called the Boiler Storage Area. We can't access it right now, but the door to this area is right next to the one we just came out of. We'll cover this place in more detail in a later episode, but right now I just want to focus on one thing: the dogs prowling along the outside of the fence. It could be nothing, but it could be a huge clue as to how Chris got into the mansion after the opening cutscene, assuming Jill's intro is the canon one. We see Chris in the intro cinematic turning to pick off a few of the pursuing dogs. As he does, the others get ahead of him in their race to the mansion. It's a bit of a stretch, but what if, realizing he didn't have enough time to get the door open before the dogs reached him, he just kept running, rounding the right side of the mansion, leaping over the fence and through the door, accidentally locking it behind him. It would explain why the dogs are pacing outside the fence. It would also explain why the dogs saw the player when they entered the L-shaped corridor, as they had just followed Chris there. As for getting over the fence, it might seem like a tall order, but if you look at the pre-rendered backgrounds, it looks like the ground is higher on the outside than on the inside. And Chris is no slouch, so it's not that hard to imagine he'd be able to clear it. So while Jill and Barry were investigating the gunshot and finding Kenneth's body, Chris was in the northeast corridor, moving further into the mansion alone, not realizing that Wesker's probably not that far behind him. Part 3 of Overthinking Resident Evil is finally over. I tried to find out what each of the paintings in the exhibition room were, but I could only find one. The painting of the woman is Empress Elizabeth of Austria by Franz Xavier Winterhalter. Apologies if I mispronounced his name. Anyway, does anyone have any idea what the others were? If you know, please write it in the comments because I spent way too long trying to find them, and I know I'm gonna lose sleep over it. Okay, I think that's all I've got. Thank you all so much for watching. Part 4 is already written, so hopefully it won't take as long as this one did. Okay, I'm gonna go lie down now.